That October night in 1854, the air over the Mallory plantation carried screams that weren't human at all, but the shrill cries of hogs tearing into something inside their pen. By the first light of dawn, only scraps of cloth and broken bones clung to the mud, while Edward Mallory, the master of the estate, had disappeared as though swallowed by the earth. Yet Hester Caldwell, the woman who filled his glass and seasoned his meals, knew exactly what had happened. She had stood in the shadows and watched those hogs destroy the last trace of the man who had once owned her, their snouts smeared with what would become the subject of hushed stories whispered for generations. Hester's path to that moment began long before blood touched the dirt. She was born in 1828 on a small farm near Natchez, torn from her mother, at 16 chained alongside 12 others and sold to Mallory's sprawling plantation outside Vicksburg. The estate was nearly 2,000 acres of delta land, its grand house rising like a crown above the river, while 300 enslaved people bent their lives to the cotton rows beneath the sun. Mallory ruled with the arrogance of a man who had never questioned his right to own another's body. His orders as heavy as chains, his whims deciding whether a child lived with its mother or was sold away forever. Hester's first years were spent in those endless fields, her hands bleeding as she tried to meet impossible quotas, her stomach twisting when she failed. Her fate shifted when Martha Mallory, the mistress of the house, pulled her into the kitchen after the cook died. From the outside, it might have looked like deliverance, but the big house brought its own brand of torment. Hester saw beatings dealt out for no reason but spite, watched families ripped apart, and felt Edward Mallory's hands when his wife was not looking. The kitchen became her battleground, a place where she could carve out small fragments of control, her skill at the stove, keeping her valuable but never safe. In time, she found solace in secret in the arms of Moses, a field hand who had been born on the estate and knew its rhythm better than most. Their love lived in stolen moments, in whispers after nightfall, and in dreams of a future they both knew the law would never allow. When Hester gave birth to their daughter Sarah in the sweltering heat of 1845, joy was tangled with dread. The child was theirs in heart, but Mallory's in law, another life reduced to property, another soul written into his ledger. Hester cradled her baby in those early months, every heartbeat a reminder that her family's survival rested on the mercy of a man who had none. Martha Mallory had made her position clear from the start. The baby would grow up in the quarters with the other enslaved children, and Hester's place was in the kitchen. But Hester refused to let go so easily. Whenever the house was quiet, she smuggled little Sarah into the kitchen, tucking her close against her chest as she stirred stews or kneaded bread, nursing her in secret between tasks. For a short while, she carved out a fragile sense of motherhood in a world determined to strip it away. That illusion shattered one bitter morning in February of 1846. Edward Mallory, desperate for cash to cover his gambling debts, announced that Sarah had been sold to a trader bound for New Orleans. The baby was barely 6 months old, still nursing, yet Edward saw her only as a drain on his profits. Hester's screams as the infant was carried out of the big house cut through the halls like a blade. Even Martha turned away in discomfort at the raw grief in her cry. Edward, unmoved, ordered Hester back to her work and threatened her with the whip if she did not quiet herself. In that moment, something inside Hester broke. She no longer lived as a woman resigned to her chains, but as one quietly bent on resistance. Outwardly, she went about her duties, serving meals and keeping the household running. Inwardly, she began to study. Every plate, every glass she set before Edward became an opportunity to note his patterns. She saw how his appetite for whiskey grew with each year, how he stumbled into his study after supper drinking until he collapsed in his chair. She noticed how Martha dulled her own misery with laudanum, drifting through her days in a fog. Even Moses's love, though deep and steadfast, could not soothe the hollow ache left by Sarah's absence. Alone, Hester wandered the grounds. After her work was done, her eyes searching the familiar landscape with new purpose. She kept returning to the hog pen behind the barn. She had watched the animals consume carcasses whole, leaving nothing but polished bones by morning. The sight planted a terrible seed in her mind. The rest of the plan came together slowly, sparked by something she discovered in the pantry. The old cook's recipe book left behind after her death contained not just instructions for meals, but notes on local plants, some harmless, others deadly. Among them was a warning about oleander, the flowering bushes that dotted the plantation grounds with pink and white blossoms. Every part of the plant was poisonous, especially the leaves when dried and ground to dust. Hester began collecting them during her walks, hiding them in secret places to dry, then grinding them into a fine powder with a mortar she had stolen from the kitchen. She tested the poison carefully, sprinkling tiny amounts for the rats that infested the quarters, watching how swiftly it killed and calculating how much would be needed for a man of Edward Mallory's size. Discovery meant certain death, but Hester no longer feared dying. What terrified her more was the idea of letting Edward continue to destroy lives unchecked. The chance she had been waiting for finally arrived on a muggy October night in 1854. Edward came back from Vicksburg in a rage, humiliated after another losing streak at the card tables. He cursed the house servant struck Moses for being slow with his horse and demanded his dinner, though he was hours late. Martha had already retreated upstairs with her laudanum bottle, leaving Hester alone to serve him. She carried out her duties with quiet precision, masking her fury with a calm face as she placed the dishes before him. Later, as expected, Edward withdrew to his study with a bottle of fine Kentucky whiskey, the same room where he tallied cotton yields and drew up contracts to buy and sell human beings like livestock. Hester knew his habits better than anyone. He would sit there for hours drinking himself into a stupor before collapsing in his chair. But tonight, for the first time, the bottle he drank from carried more than whiskey. It carried the weight of her revenge. Tonight, justice came to the Mallory plantation. Hester waited until Edward Mallory was deep in his usual stupor in the study, then carried a silver tray with a plate of his favorite honey cakes and the glass he always asked for. She dusted the sweets to hide any hint of bitterness and set them down without a tremor, watching him take bite after bite while he muttered about his losses at cards and complained about Martha. He washed the sweets down with whiskey, praised the food, and sent her away. And Hester obeyed, slipping back to the kitchen to wait for the moment she had planned for so long. An hour later, she heard the scrape of his chair and the confused muttering that meant the poison was taking hold. Through the crack in the door, she watched him stagger, clutch his gut, try to call for help, and finally collapse in a violent spasm before lying still on the Persian rug. She felt no triumph, only a hollow steadiness where grief had been. And then the hardest part of all began. Moving with the same careful, quiet efficiency she used in the kitchen, Hester went into the study, wrapped the man who had taken her daughter in a blanket, and hauled him out through the French doors. The moon hid her as she crossed the yard and slipped into the pig pen behind the barn, leaving the animals to finish what she could not live through seeing. She returned to the kitchen as if nothing had happened, hands steady, face controlled, while inside a cold, private relief settled into her bones and the plantation went on, under a sky that still seemed to care for nothing and no one. The hogs smelled the body before Hester even reached their pens, squealing and pushing against the fence in anticipation. She had trained them for this moment, slipping scraps into the pen in the evenings so they would come to expect her arrival with food. Now she dragged Mallory's body through the gate and rolled it into the mud. The animals descended instantly, the night air filled with the wet tearing of flesh and the snap of bones. It was a dreadful sound, but Hester stayed where she was standing guard until the work was done. By the time dawn broke over the Mississippi Delta, only a few shreds of fabric and bits of bone were left, no different from the remains of livestock the hogs had been fed before. Hester gathered the scraps and buried them in scattered places across the grounds where no one would ever think to look. When Martha finally stirred from her laudanum fog the next day, the house fell into chaos. Edward's horse was missing, his riding clothes gone, and several whiskey bottles had vanished. To everyone, it looked like the master had simply ridden off drunk in the night, chasing cards or women in Vicksburg. Martha sent riders down every road, questioned every enslaved person, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. Hester played her part with practiced ease, feigning worry and offering polite concern. While inside, she marveled at how easily the deception held. Among the enslaved community, however, there was a quiet shift. Moses's eyes found hers in the yard, and she saw in his look that he understood. Whispers began to pass through the quarters. Soft words of hope threaded with fear as people dared to imagine life without Edward Mallory's shadow pressing down on them. In the big house, Martha slipped deeper into her medicine, leaving control to the overseer, a man too lazy to enforce discipline with the same iron grip Edward had wielded. Slowly, the rhythm of life at the plantation changed, small freedoms appearing where none had existed before. Yet Hester carried the truth alone. She told no one, not even Moses, guarding the secret that Edward Mallory's reign had ended in a hog pen under the cover of darkness. She continued her work in the kitchen as if nothing had changed all the while, knowing that the sale of the plantation would one day scatter them all. For now her revenge was complete, but the uncertain future of 300 lives still weighed on her shoulders. That winter came early and hard, sealing the Mississippi in ice and cutting the plantation off from the world. For Hester, the isolation was a gift. It gave her time to think, to let the reality of what she had done sink into her bones while she watched the slow transformation of life around her. Without Edward's ruthless hand, the enslaved community began to reorganize itself, leaning on one another in ways that had once been impossible. Moses, steady and level-headed, became a natural leader, guiding the quarters through the cold months with calm authority. Even the hogs that had devoured Edward seemed to thrive, growing fat and strong. Hester found dark satisfaction in that irony. The master who once threatened to feed rebellious slaves to the animals had himself become their feast. It was a secret only she carried, one more truth locked inside her heart. Spring brought change from the outside world. Rumors of conflict between North and South grew louder, and Martha's brother Charles Brennan arrived from New Orleans to take charge of the plantation. Nervous and pale, Brennan lacked Edward's cruelty, but had little clarity of his own, creating uncertainty among both the enslaved and the white staff. He launched a thorough investigation into Edward's disappearance, digging through ledgers and questioning servants. Hester held her breath as he lingered in the study where the murder had taken place. But months of firelight ink stains and everyday use had erased every trace. Even when Brennan remarked on how well fed the hogs had seemed that winter, the overseer smugly credited his own efficiency with the feeding schedule, and Brennan moved on. He was more concerned with finances than livestock. By mid-1855, it was clear Edward was gone for good. Martha, consumed by her laudanum addiction, could barely function, and Brennan convinced her to sell the estate and return with him to New Orleans. That decision sealed the fate of the hundreds enslaved on the plantation. The auction that followed was brutal, a marketplace of grief where families were torn apart with the flick of a hand. Buyers appraised men and women like cattle, ignoring bonds of blood and love. Hester watched in anguish as Moses was sold to a planter in Alabama, their farewell reduced to the brief press of hands before he was driven away in a wagon. Hester herself was purchased on the final day by Elizabeth Crawford, a middle-aged widow from Natchez. Mrs. Crawford was no abolitionist. She accepted slavery as part of her life. But she treated Hester with a distant politeness, neither vicious nor indulgent. The household was small, with only 6 enslaved people a world away, from the sprawling empire of the Mallorys. The pace of life was slower, quieter, giving Hester space to reflect. She cooked, she worked, and she thought. Edward Mallory was gone, but the institution that had enabled him still bound her. Even so, in the quiet rhythm of Natchez, Hester began to gather the strength to imagine what might come next. The secret of Edward Mallory's fate remained Hester's alone, though in the still hours of the night she sometimes wondered if Moses had known during their final goodbye. The war that loomed on the horizon promised a freedom too distant to grasp, but too powerful to ignore, and she clung to it as both hope and torment. When Mrs. Crawford's health declined in the winter of 1856, Hester found herself in the strange position of tending to the woman who owned her. The widow's coughing fits worsened until she drifted in and out of fevered delirium, at times speaking to Hester not as property, but as a companion confessing childhood fears and wondering aloud what would become of her household after death. In March of 1857, Crawford passed away, and her estate was quickly dissolved. For Hester, that meant another auction block. She was sold to James Richardson, a young planter eager to prove himself near Vicksburg. The cruel irony of being returned to the very region where she had once ended. Edward Mallory's life did not escape her. Richardson, barely seasoned, carried the arrogance of a man who believed cruelty was strength. His plantation was smaller than the Mallory Empire, but just as merciless, and Hester was driven back into the fields, her hands split and bleeding from cotton once more. Memories she had tried to bury rose with each lash of the overseer's whip and each impossible quota. She began again, the quiet study of her master's habits, observing his reliance on whiskey, mapping the structure of his household, noting the same poisonous oleander that thrived along the fence lines. But the world beyond the plantation was shifting. As political storms gathered, Richardson boasted about Southern rights and prepared his enslaved men for battle, deluded enough to believe they would fight for the system that bound them. When several fled in the summer of 1858, he reacted with fury, setting dogs and patrols on their trail, but recovering none. Hester weighed her own chances of escape, but her secret was a tether. If captured, she might break under torture and expose the truth about Edward Mallory. The risk was too great. Survival, she decided, depended on silence and patience. By 1860, Lincoln's election sent panic through Mississippi. Richardson's fiery talk turned into action when the state seceded in January of 1861. War had arrived at last. Richardson enlisted as a Confederate captain, leaving the plantation in the hands of his aging father and the overseer. The old man, consumed by paranoia, believed rebellion brewed in every corner of the quarters, and punishments grew harsher than ever. For Hester, it was as if Edward Mallory's ghost had returned in the form of a trembling, suspicious patriarch whose cruelty was sharpened by fear. The war that promised freedom also brought new terrors, and she knew survival would demand more than endurance. It would demand calculation, and perhaps one day, another act as final as the one she had carried out years before. The war struck the Richardson plantation like a storm that would not pass. With so many young white men gone to fight and the Union blockade choking southern ports, supplies dwindled fast. Enslaved people saw their rations cut again and again, while the white family clung to its comforts, relying on stored goods and favors from neighboring planters. Hester watched friends and loved ones waste away with hunger, while Richardson's father grumbled about inconvenience, blind to the suffering all around him. By 1862, news of Union victories filtered through whispers from field hands on nearby estates. Scraps of talk carried by deserters desperate for food. Each report lit a spark in the quarters. Freedom, once a fragile fantasy, began to feel real. When Union forces captured New Orleans, the planter class trembled. But for Hester, it meant hope. Maybe she could search for Sarah, Maybe she could live as more than property. Richardson's father, however, grew more dangerous as his paranoia deepened. He imagined rebellion in every corner, punishing people before they could even breathe suspicion. That summer, 3 men were whipped to death simply for meeting after dark, their bodies left hanging as grim warnings. It was Edward Mallory all over again, only now sharpened by the fear of a crumbling Confederacy. Hester recognized the signs, recognized the routines, the late-night drinking, the quiet hours in the study with letters and ledgers. The oleander still grew just as it had at Mallory's estate. The hogs still grunted in their pen, hungry for anything that fell into their trough. But Hester hesitated. Years had passed since Edward's death, and she had learned that killing one man never killed the system that raised him. The war itself offered the possibility of breaking that system forever. Violence, once her only path, no longer seemed like the only answer. Still, her hand was forced when Richardson's father announced plans to sell off most of the plantation's enslaved people before Union troops could free them, sending families deep into Confederate territory where freedom might never reach. That was a wound Hester could not endure again. So she returned to the plan she knew. The honey cakes dusted with oleander, the glass of whiskey set at his side. This time the poison worked even faster. The old man's frailty betrayed him, his collapse more sudden, his death more abrupt. The hogs, thinner from wartime scarcity, devoured his remains, before dawn leaving only scraps of fabric to bury in the mud. By morning it looked as though Richardson's father had simply ridden away, his horse missing his rifle, gone a plausible story for a man who often boasted about joining his son in the fight. The overseer, suddenly in charge, cared little for discipline. With Union forces moving steadily upriver and Confederate control unraveling, he focused on hoarding valuables and preparing for his own escape. The fields loosened. The lash fell silent. And one by one enslaved families slipped into the night, following the whispered trails toward Union lines and the freedom that now seemed close enough to touch. Hester lingered on the Richardson plantation longer than most. Survival was safer there than risking the unknown, and the weight of her secrets, 2 powerful men vanished without a trace, kept her cautious of drawing attention from Union or Confederate eyes. But by 1863, the war had hollowed out the South, leaving plantations abandoned and authority crumbling. When Union control began to spread across Mississippi, she knew it was time to leave. Traveling with a small band of others, she braved weeks of dangerous roads, where desperate men hunted runaways for bounty. Their goal was Vicksburg, where Union forces had established camps for freed people. The city Hester returned to bore little resemblance to the Vicksburg of her youth. Once a proud river hub, it was scarred by siege. Its buildings damaged, its people scattered. Contraband camps overflowed with thousands of former slaves seeking food safety and recognition. Life there was harsh, but it was freedom. For Hester, that was enough. She quickly became valuable to Union officers, eager for intelligence about the countryside, sharing what she knew of supply routes, troop movements, and plantations still holding hundreds in bondage. She never mentioned Edward Mallory or Richardson's father. Those deaths remained buried with the hogs that had consumed them. As she worked with Union officials, she listened closely to stories from other freed slaves, piecing together fragments of where people had been sold, where families might be reunited. Sarah remained at the heart of her search. Letters were sent to New Orleans, Mobile, and beyond, tracing the shadow of the little girl torn from her arms so long ago. Hope fueled her, carrying her through the hardships of camp life and the endless uncertainty of a country at war. In 1865, when word came of Confederate surrender, Vicksburg erupted in celebration. Freed men and women sang and wept, but beneath the joy lay fear. What would freedom look like when the soldiers left? Hester celebrated too, though quietly, her thoughts drifting to her secrets. In this new world, without Confederate officials prying into old mysteries, perhaps the past would finally remain buried. She found steady work as a cook for Colonel William Hayes, an Ohio officer stationed in Mississippi whose respect for her skills marked a profound shift from the world she had known. His wife Margaret became her ally in the search for Sarah, reaching into networks of charities and northern families. Together they traced the shattered paths of the slave trade. Records were scarce, names often changed, but bit by bit, the pieces aligned. Then, in the summer of 1866, a letter arrived from New Orleans. It bore the news Hester had feared and dreaded in equal measure. Sarah had been sold to a sugar plantation south of the city. She had not grown up, not married, not lived to see freedom. She had died in 1851 at just 6 years old, lost to a yellow fever epidemic that swept through the children's quarters, buried in an unmarked grave among dozens of others. The news broke Hester. Yet it gave her something she had long been denied: closure. For the first time in 2 decades, she could grieve openly, no longer chasing a hope that had already been buried in the Louisiana soil. At 38, she was older than most women who had endured what she had. But she still had years ahead of her years that would be lived in freedom. The men she had killed would remain wartime mysteries, remembered only as planters who vanished into chaos. But Hester knew the truth. They were the price of survival, the price of justice, and the shadows she would carry with her for the rest of her life. When the Hayes family received orders to transfer to Kansas in the autumn of 1866, they offered Hester the chance to join them. Leaving Mississippi was no small decision. It meant abandoning the familiar, even the broken pieces of community she had found in the aftermath of slavery, in exchange for a distant land where the rules of life were still unknown. Yet the alternative was remaining in the South, where Reconstruction already faced violent backlash from men determined to rebuild slavery by another name. The journey north carried Hester through landscapes unlike anything she had known in bondage. Small towns, broad farmland, and new communities revealed a wider world than the plantations had ever allowed her to imagine. Though racism remained a constant, Kansas was different. In Lawrence, a town with deep roots in the fight against slavery, she found space to breathe. Working for families alongside her duties with the Hayes household, she built a reputation as a skilled cook, eventually earning enough to open her own modest restaurant on Massachusetts Street in 1868. Soldiers from the nearby fort townsfolk and travelers all came to taste her dishes, and her honey cakes became her signature. Few knew the dark irony attached to them. Only Hester remembered that the very recipe had once been her weapon of vengeance. Her business not only gave her independence, but also drew her into a growing community of freed people who had chosen Kansas as their new beginning. They carried different histories, but shared the same scars and hopes. In their company, Hester found kinship and resilience, though she kept her most dangerous memories locked away. In 1870, she met David Washington, a former slave from Virginia, who had fought for the Union and now worked as a blacksmith. Their courtship unfolded gently, each step shaped by respect and the mutual understanding of two people who had fought hard for the right to choose their own lives. Their marriage, celebrated in Lawrence's small black church, was a moment of quiet triumph, not just for them, but for the community that gathered to witness former slaves free to marry by choice. David's patience became her anchor. He had seen enough horror in war to recognize the shadows that sometimes overtook her, the silences she would not explain, the nightmares she could not shake. He never pressed her, never demanded confessions, and in his quiet acceptance she found peace she had never believed possible. In 1872, Hester gave birth to their son, James. Holding him for the first time, she felt memories of Sarah return in a rush, memories of loss, grief, and longing. But this time, those emotions were softened by hope. James would never be torn from her arms, never sold to strangers, never reduced to property. He was born free, into a family of his mother's making. And for Hester, that single truth was the ultimate measure of victory. The birth of James had filled Hester with a joy so sharp, it cut its brightness, always edged by sorrow for the daughter she had lost, and a fierce vow that her son would never know the chains that had scarred her own life. Raising a child in freedom meant making choices about what truths to share and which to carry in silence. James grew up hearing about the plantation days, but always through the lens of resilience and survival stories of community courage and endurance. The darker details, the blood and poison, the hogs in the night, she never spoke aloud. Those belonged only to her. By the 1870s, her restaurant had become one of Lawrence's proudest establishments. Its growth allowing her to expand into a neighboring building and employ other freed people who, like her, had made their way to Kansas in search of a steadier future. The honey cakes that once masked poison now carried nothing but sweetness, a signature dish that made her name respected throughout the town. They became a symbol of survival, transformed into success. Yet Hester remained watchful. She read the papers and listened to travelers. Reports from the South grew darker each year. Freed people hunted, murdered, or driven off their land as white supremacist groups rose in power. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 confirmed her fears. She knew then that her decision to leave Mississippi had been the only path to safety. The old secrets she carried Edward Mallory Richardson's father were no longer active threats. Too much time had passed. Those men had become shadows of a world slipping into myth, their disappearances written off as curiosities of the war years. Her 50th birthday in 1878 was a moment of triumph. Friends, neighbors, and fellow freedmen filled her restaurant with laughter and music. They toasted not just Hester, but the collective miracle of survival. The journey from being counted as property to standing as business owners, artisans, and citizens. David's toast to his wife was tender, praising her strength and unyielding spirit. He had no idea just how much those qualities had cost her or what they had required her to do. Then, in 1879, the past came calling. A letter arrived from a lawyer in Vicksburg sent to former Mallory slaves in an attempt to settle the estate of Martha Mallory, who had finally succumbed to her laudanum addiction. The lawyer sought testimony about Edward's disappearance, hoping to clear the legal obstacles to distributing property. That letter, arriving by way of the very network Hester had once used to search for Sarah, chilled her more deeply than anything since her escape. For the first time in decades, her secrets felt exposed. Her instinct was to burn the letter to vanish from its reach. But she knew silence could be more suspicious than words. So she answered. Her reply was crafted as carefully as any meal she had ever served, plain enough to satisfy, cautious enough to mislead. She admitted her years in the Mallory kitchen, but claimed ignorance of her master's fate, describing him instead as a man of vices and wanderings, prone to leaving without notice for gambling trips or business in New Orleans. It was a portrait plausible enough to close off further questions, a version of truth that bore no trace of the night the hogs squealed in the dark. The lawyer never wrote back. And with that silence, Hester knew she had once again outlived the men who had sought to own her and the secrets that could never be spoken aloud. Hester's carefully worded replies to the Vicksburg lawyer had been just enough truthful where they could be silent where they had to be. She admitted her service in the kitchen, described Edward Mallory as a man prone to wandering, and offered the names of others who might have known more, though most had long since been sold away or lost to time. Eventually, the questions dwindled, the lawyer's tone shifting from determination to resignation. Too many years had passed, too many lives scattered or ended. The case was quietly abandoned, and with it the last official thread that could have unraveled her secret. For Hester, The silence that followed was confirmation Edward Mallory's fate had been buried as deeply as the bones of slavery itself. Yet the ordeal left her unsettled. The world had changed since those plantation nights. Railroads now spanned the continent. Telegraph wires carried words in moments, and the postal system stitched Kansas to Mississippi in ways unthinkable in her youth. Secrets, she realized, were no longer as safe as distance. What had once felt like another world was now just a letter away. Through the 1880s, new challenges replaced old ones. James grew restless with questions, his teenage mind hungry for truth. Hester told him what she could of the strength of enslaved communities, of quiet resistance, of the miracle of freedom. But she left out the blood, the poison, the hogs in the night. Some truths, she knew, were not fit to pass on, not even to her own son. When David Washington collapsed in his blacksmith shop in 1884, Hester was widowed once more. The loss cut deeply. David had been the only man who had known her fully in freedom, the one presence that steadied her shadows without demanding their explanation. Alone now, she poured herself into raising James, who became the heart of her existence. The restaurant, still thriving, kept her secure, surrounded by a community that saw her not as property, but as a pillar, a woman of respect, whose honeycakes had become a local treasure. James's graduation in 1886 filled her with pride that defied words. Watching him walk across the stage in a world where education had once been a crime for her people was almost more than her heart could bear. In a single generation, her family had leapt from forbidden literacy to celebrated achievement. It was the proof that her sacrifices, her silences, her survival had not been in vain. But in 1887, when James was 19, he announced a plan that turned Hester cold. He wanted to travel south to trace family roots, to see the places where she and his father had been enslaved. His excitement was pure, innocent curiosity, but Hester felt dread coil in her stomach. His journey could stir old memories, unearth questions no one was meant to ask. The truth long hidden might rise again in ways that could ruin everything she had built. She knew then that silence was no longer enough. Her son had to hear from her own lips what she had spent decades guarding. And so one night in the quiet of their home, Hester began the hardest conversation of her life. She told James that freedom had not come to her by chance or by war alone. That survival sometimes demanded choices too heavy to speak of. And though she chose her words with care, though she spared him the worst of the details, she let him glimpse the shadowed strength that had carried her from bondage into freedom. It was not just a confession, it was a handing down of legacy. For the first time, Hester allowed someone else to bear even a part of the weight she had carried alone for more than 30 years. James sat in silence as his mother spoke the truth she had carried for more than 30 years. The story of poison hidden in honeycakes of bodies, dragged under cover of darkness to the hog pens of squeals and bones ground into the Mississippi mud. All of it reshaped the woman he thought he knew. At first he struggled to reconcile the gentle cook, the woman who fed the hungry and nursed the sick with the cold precision of the acts she described. But slowly, he began to understand. Slavery had given his mother no choices but survival. And survival sometimes meant striking back in the only way possible. What had once seemed unimaginable became in his eyes proof of her courage and brilliance. Their bond shifted from one of protection and silence to one of honesty and respect. Yet both knew that this truth would never be spoken beyond them. It was a legacy that would die in their bloodline, not in the public record. The years wore Hester down, though never her spirit. By the 1890s, her hands once deft with knives and dough stiffened with arthritis. She leaned more on her employees to run the restaurant, while James stepped into responsibility with quiet pride. He built his own business ventures, yet always honored his mother's independence, letting her remain the matriarch of the household and the community she had helped shape. Lawrence had come to revere her as one of its most respected citizens, a living bridge between slavery and freedom. As the century turned, Hester reflected on the vast sweep of history she had witnessed. Born into bondage, she had lived to see freedom won, schools built, and her own son walk across a stage with a diploma in hand. Yet she also saw the creeping tide of racial terror and segregation rise again, reminders that progress was fragile, always contested. Through it all, she clung to the knowledge that her life and her sons embodied proof that the enslaved had been far more than victims. They had been survivors, builders, visionaries. When she died in 1902 at 74, her funeral overflowed with neighbors, friends, and former slaves who had made new lives in Kansas. They praised her for her perseverance, her generosity, her quiet dignity. None of them knew the full truth of what she had done to carve her way to freedom. That truth remained with James, who kept his mother's secret until his own death in 1937. He carried it like an heirloom, protecting her name, while understanding that her acts of rebellion had been the fire that allowed his own future. In Mississippi, the official records never told the real story. Edward Mallory's disappearance was chalked up to gambling debts and drink, while Richardson's father was dismissed as another casualty of wartime chaos. Historians writing about the plantations mentioned the mysteries, but never guessed the truth that an enslaved woman had poisoned them both and left their remains to the hogs. The bones that weren't consumed sank into the delta soil, feeding the very cotton plants that had once demanded enslaved labor. In that cycle of decay and renewal lay a hidden kind of justice, one that pleased Hester. Even if she never knew it, her master's body turned into the Krapier he had ruled over. His power dissolved back into the land he had claimed to own. Hester Caldwell Washington's legacy lived not in the official histories, but in the lives she touched, the freedom she claimed, and the family she left behind. Her story was one of survival, resistance, and transformation. The proof that even in the darkest corners of bondage, a woman could carve out justice with her own hands and shape a future beyond the reach of those who once claimed to own her. The Mallory plantation did not survive the weight of history. After Martha's death, with no heirs capable of restoring it, the estate decayed into silence. The mansion where Edward had once ruled and where Hester had served her honey cakes became a husk, its fine drapes moth-eaten, its marble floors cracked, its grand columns strangled by vines. Owls roosted in the rafters. Possums nested in the corners, and the air of wealth that had once surrounded it dissolved into mildew and dust. The hog pen, once the scene of Hester's quiet act of vengeance, sank under years of dirt and debris until nothing remained but the memory of squeals no one alive could recall. By the turn of the 20th century, visitors who stumbled upon the site found only weeds and crumbling foundations, no marker to remind them of the human lives spent and taken on that land. For the descendants of the enslaved who had lived there, the plantation existed only in scraps of memory and whispered stories. Census records and ledgers had reduced their ancestors to numbers on a page, units of property instead of men, women, and children. But among the people themselves, tales lingered. Families carried them north to the industrial cities, west to the frontier towns, or kept them alive in the Mississippi Delta itself. And in those retellings, a theme endured. Edward Mallory had not vanished of his own accord. Justice, they said in hushed tones, had found him. It was a truth never proven, never written down yet, never entirely silenced. Moses Williams, the man who had once loved Hester and fathered her daughter Sarah, lived long enough to see those whispers harden into legend. After being sold into the hellish fields of Alabama, he escaped during the Confederacy's final collapse, fleeing south to Mobile and then northward until he reached Detroit. There he built a new life in the rising automobile industry, raising children who knew him as a quiet, hard-working father, but never fully knew the scars of his past. For decades, Hester remained a memory sealed away, a loss too painful to revisit. Then, in 1923, nearly 70 years after Edward's disappearance, Moses received a letter that carried her name back to him. It was from James Washington Hester's son. James had devoted much of his life to preserving the histories of the enslaved community from which he came gathering stories before they vanished with the last of that generation. Through church records and old acquaintances, he had traced Moses to Detroit and asked to meet. Their meeting took place that summer in a modest boarding house. Moses, frail but sharp-eyed at 80, sat across from James now, a middle-aged man with his mother's steady presence. They represented two eras of Black America. Moses, born into chains, who had lived to see freedom arrive through fire and war, and James, born free, who had inherited both the burdens and the possibilities of that freedom. The conversation stretched long into the evening as James spoke of his mother's life in Kansas, her restaurant, her resilience. He did not reveal the full truth of her acts of vengeance that remained between himself and the grave. But he gave Moses something else, the knowledge that Hester had survived, that she had thrived, that she had loved and been loved to the end. For Moses, it was both a balm and a sorrow. He had carried her memory for a lifetime, not knowing what had become of her, fearing she had been lost forever. Now at last, he learned she had built a life beyond slavery's shadow, a life their daughter Sarah had never lived to see. In that Detroit room, the past and present briefly touched, binding together the fragments of a story too often erased. The ruins of the Mallory plantation stood forgotten in Mississippi soil. But in that moment, its true history of cruelty, resistance, love, and survival was alive in the voices of two men who carried it forward. James had come to Detroit not just to collect history, but to preserve his mother's truth before it faded into silence. 20 years younger than Moses, though already frail from the heart condition that shadowed his life, he listened with care as the old man pieced together the story of the Mallory plantation. Their shared recollections formed a tapestry of cruelty and resilience. The endless fields, the whip's crack, the whispered songs that carried hope when hope seemed impossible. Moses spoke with a voice softened by age, but sharpened by memory. He recalled Hester as she had been when they were young, brilliant, determined, quick to laugh in rare moments of respite, but carrying a fire inside her that refused to be extinguished. He remembered her love for their daughter Sarah, a devotion fierce enough to defy despair, and the quiet fury that burned hotter after Sarah was sold away. When Edward Mallory vanished not long after Moses had suspected more than he dared to say. Hester had carried herself differently, then relieved yet wary, as though guarding a truth no one else could touch. James weighed his promise to his mother against the yearning in Moses's eyes. Here was the man who had once been her anchor, who had lost her without knowing why. Could he deny him the truth now, when time itself was running out for them both? As the hours lengthened, James chose honesty. In a low voice, he told Moses what only he had known since that night long ago, how Hester had laced Mallory's honey cakes with oleander, how she had dragged his body into the hog pen, how the animals had erased him as surely as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. Moses bowed his head, overcome not by horror, but by understanding. The revelation lifted a weight he had carried for nearly 70 years, confirming what his heart had always suspected, but his tongue had never dared speak. Hester, the woman he had loved, had not been powerless after all. She had struck back in the only way possible, delivering justice in a world that offered none. Pride mingled with grief in his voice as he murmured that her act was not murder, but rebellion. Not a crime, but an answer to cruelty that had demanded its own reckoning. In the days that followed, James and Moses wove together their memories. one recalling Hester's youth in bondage, the other her strength in freedom. Between them, they built a fuller picture of her life, a woman forged in slavery, hardened by loss, and redeemed by her own courage. For James, it was a chance to honor his mother's legacy with someone who had known her heart. For Moses, it was a final reunion with the truth of the woman he had never stopped loving. By the time James returned to Kansas, both men understood that they had created something larger than themselves. Together, they had preserved the hidden history of Hester Caldwell Washington, not as a tale of crime, but as a testament to survival resistance and the quiet, unrecorded war waged by the enslaved against those who sought to break them. The Hester Caldwell who emerged from James and Moses' final conversations was no myth. No saint cast in marble, and no villain either. She was something far more human, a woman who had been cornered by a brutal system and had answered with a ruthlessness born of necessity. Her later achievements, the restaurant, the community she built in Kansas, the family she nurtured in freedom, shone even brighter when placed against the shadows of the choices she had made to reach that freedom. When Moses died in 1926, the last living witness to Hester's youth was gone. His death closed a door on the antebellum world, leaving only James to carry the full truth. That burden grew heavier as the country itself faltered. The Great Depression stripped away much of what Hester had built. James lost his businesses and in the worst years was forced to sell the restaurant that had been his mother's pride. Its recipes lived on, but stripped of their history. The honey cakes, once steeped in both terror and triumph, became just another sweet sold without context until even they disappeared from local menus. Eventually, the old restaurant building was torn down, another casualty of progress that erased as much as it created. When James died in 1937, he carried his mother's darkest secrets into the grave. The story of Edward Mallory and Richardson's father remains sealed in silence, reduced in the public record to two unexplained vanishings from the chaotic years of war. Hester's private war against slavery became just another absence folded into the countless silences that defined so much of Black history in America before the Civil Rights era. Only after World War II, as America was forced to reckon with its own contradictions, did attention return to the lives of the enslaved. By the 1960s, researchers began combing through what little remained of the Mallory estate's records. They interviewed descendants, pieced together ledgers and inventories, and tried to reconstruct the rhythms of daily life on a plantation that had once ruled thousands of acres of Delta land. Edward Mallory's disappearance surfaced in these studies, but it was treated as little more than an oddity, a planter gone missing, another casualty of the instability that rocked the South before the Civil War. The rise of the civil rights movement changed the lens through which such histories were viewed. Where earlier generations of historians had portrayed enslaved people as passive victims, new scholarship recognized them as actors in their own liberation. Resistance was reinterpreted in all its forms, from running away to subtle sabotage and sometimes to violence. Acts like Hester's, once dismissed as unthinkable, began to find a place in the broader conversation about how enslaved people fought back against a system designed to erase their humanity. By the late 20th century, with advances in DNA testing and forensic archaeology, scholars began to ask questions that had long gone unanswered. Could mysteries like Edward Mallory's fate ever be solved? Could soil and bone fragments tell a story that written records refused to preserve? Though no one knew it, the Delta Earth still held traces of the night when Hester Caldwell chose justice in her own hands. When a master's power ended, not in courts or ledgers, but in the squeals of hogs under a Mississippi sky. More than a century after Edward Mallory's disappearance, time itself had conspired to erase nearly all traces of what had happened that October night. The plantation site had been built over, plowed under, and reshaped so many times that even if archaeologists had known where to dig, there was little chance of finding physical evidence. What remained instead was memory shifting, layered, and carried in the voices of descendants. By the early 21st century, the rise of genealogical research, online archives, and digital family history projects gave new life to those memories. People whose ancestors had once lived in bondage on the Mallory plantation began connecting across states and generations, piecing together fragments of stories that had survived in whispers, letters, and family lore. The fate of Edward Mallory remained one of the most persistent mysteries in these exchanges. Some descendants insisted he had fled the plantation in disgrace, undone by debts and shame. Others repeated darker tales that he had been taken by the very people he had once owned, swallowed not by the Mississippi wilderness, but by justice carried out in secret. The silence Hester and her son had kept ensured no record would ever confirm those rumors. Yet the very persistence of such legends spoke to a deeper truth. Enslaved people had never been passive victims. Their defiance, whether through flight sabotage, rebellion, or in Hester's case, carefully planned violence, had always existed, even when the historical record refused to admit it. As museums and historical sites in the 21st century took up the challenge of telling slavery's story, curators wrestled with how to present acts like Hester's. Was it murder or resistance? Was it crime or justice? The answer depended not on the law of her time, which offered enslaved people no protection, but on the context of survival in a system designed to crush both body and spirit. To many, her actions symbolized the most desperate form of self-defense, an assertion of humanity in a world that denied it. In Lawrence, Kansas, long after her restaurant had closed and her building had been demolished, the memory of Hester's cooking lingered in recipes that influenced local kitchens. Her honey cakes, stripped of their darker associations, became remembered only as a sweet. Yet beneath their sugar lay a hidden history of poison and power, a transformation from weapon to celebration. They embodied the very arc of her life, from bondage and silence to freedom and creation. The complete truth of her story remained buried with those who had sworn to protect it. But the themes that shaped her life, courage, protection of family, defiance in the face of systemic cruelty, and the determination to create dignity where none was given, lived on. Whether spoken in family gatherings, taught in classrooms, or reflected upon in museums, Hester Caldwell Washington's journey continued to resonate as both cautionary tale and inspiration. Her legacy was not simply the two masters who vanished from history, but the life she built afterward, a proof that, even in a world built on dehumanization, it was possible to carve out freedom, community, and meaning. In that sense, Hester's story became larger than the secrets she kept. It became part of the enduring testimony of how enslaved people remade themselves and America in the long struggle from bondage to freedom.